Okay, well, I think we're being recorded, so let's get started. And it's really lovely to be here. My name's Briony Hudson, and I'm an independent pharmacy historian and museum curator. And I was delighted to be asked to chair this panel because its title tells you everything we need to know: objects, museums, and names, and that's my day job. I used to be the museum curator at the Royal Pharmaceuticals Society from 2002 to 2010. I'm also a past president of the British Society for the History of Pharmacy, and I'm really interested to hear the three papers we've got this afternoon or morning, depending on where you are in the world. It's 5 o'clock here in the UK. What I'll do is follow the pattern of the other sessions. So if you're not speaking, you will be muted with your video off, please. Any questions you've got, please pop them in the chat whenever you feel the need, but we'll come to those after we've had all three speakers talk, and we'll go from one to the other fairly seamlessly. So I'll very briefly introduce them now, and then we'll get started, and hope you enjoy it. And as I say, please feel free to drop any comments or any questions in the chat. I'll facilitate the question asking at the end to keep it nice and smooth. Okay, so our three speakers today, the first is Laura Robson Mainwaring, and she works at the National Archives here in the UK. She is going to be talking with a paper titled Own Name, No Name, and the Plague of Fancy Names in the Pharmaceutical Market between about 1870 and 1920, and that builds on the research that Laura did for her PhD. We then have Violetta Barbashina, who joins us from New York, I believe. She's a pathologist at Sloan Kettering, but also an independent medical historian. And her paper today is titled In Charity for the Sake of Charity and With Charity, the Ointment Jar and the Virtue of Caritas in the Apothecary's Practice. And our third speaker is Katarzyna Jarosz, and she is based at the University of Logistics and Transport in Wrocław in Poland. And the title of Katarzyna's paper is The Development of Museums of Pharmacy in Post-Soviet Countries. So I think without further ado, I'll hand over to Laura for the first paper. Thank you, Laura.
All right, thank you, Briony, and thank you also to the conference organisers for a great conference so far. I'm going to try and share my screen here. And there we go. Okay, so this paper is based on my research on the British trade in commercial remedies undertaken as part of my PhD on branding, packaging and trademarks in the medical marketplace between 1870 and 1920. So the market for medicines in the 19th and early 20th century was made up of four broad main categories, which included home remedies, chemists' own concoctions, generic medicines made up from official pharmacopoeias, and factory-produced medicines. This latter group, in the form of pre-packaged medicines sold under a branded name, began to dominate the British market. In 1906, an editorial in the Pharmaceutical Journal, the official publication of the Royal Pharmaceutical Society in Britain, published a tirade against the plague of fancy names for chemical substances in pharmacy, noting that, quote, half a dozen owners of protected words may apply them to one and the same article produced by a single manufacturer, and the poor pharmacist may be called upon to stock 6 different lots of that drug in order that he may legally dispense what is ordered by 6 prescribers. Likewise, in reference to the drug acetyl salicylic acid, the medical journal The Lancet reported on the practice of the trade applying fancy trademarks to compounds, which included aspirin and Zaxa, amongst others, asking how it was desirable for public health that the state should protect separate proprietary interests, which was for all intents and purposes the same article. So this is not to say that branded medicines were a new phenomenon. Makers' marks had been used for centuries within commercial exchanges to identify a manufacturer's work, and proprietary medicines in particular have been identified as early examples of product branding, with a number of popular brands becoming established in the 17th century with the likes of Anderson's pills and Daffy's elixir, which were sold in colonial markets. And looking at medical advertisements in the 18th century, for example, Hannah Barker found that branding and trademarks were significant means by which trust could be formed within an expanding urban environment. However, the changing market in the late 19th century with regards to trademark legislation in the British context has only received limited commentary from historians of medicine and pharmacy. It has, however, been established by business historians that developments in legislation in the late 19th century led to the widespread use of trademarks for the marketing of consumer goods and marked a major shift in the nature of branding. And looking away from the more sort of unscrupulous examples of product branding found in the lay press, I look at professional and trade publications to unpick how these groups viewed and trademarks. There was regular commentary on commercial legislation in publications like the trade periodical, the Chemist and Druggist, and the Pharmaceutical Journal, where readers frequented the correspondence columns asking for advice relating to new trademark laws and regulations. So this paper aims to unpick how trademark legislation and changing branding practices impacted how medicines were sold and consumed on a local, national, and international scale. So the range of items available in this period can be gauged from price lists and catalogues produced by pharmaceutical firms. Distinguishing between these products was difficult as many firms offered similar products, so distinctive trade names became increasingly important. Transactions that took place through personal one-to-one exchanges did not rely so heavily on the ability to transfer reputation and identity across via the material aspects of the product through its package, container, or label. So with this depersonalization, makers' marks developed greater commercial significance as a means to communicate information about the product's efficacy and credibility, and those within the chain of distribution became significant. As such, the medical profession and the trade, which included retail chemists and wholesale druggists, became important intermediaries between manufacturers and the end consumer for disseminating branded commercial medicines. Before the mid-19th century, the law concerning trademarks was very fragmented and rested on common law and on legal precedents without any specific legislation. Common law, however, was inadequate for the changing nature of the commercial and industrial market, which is evidenced by increasingly problematic court cases. So with the establishment of a central register of trademarks under the Trademarks Legislation Act of 1875, trademarks became property in a legal sense for the first time and were given a broad definition. The marks registered encompassed a range of styles, from an array of graphical fonts, elaborate illustrations, labels, and signatures. After the enactment of the legislation on 1st January 1876, advertisements began emphasising the registered status of their marks, and statements such as trademark on every bottle, and without which none are genuine, began to be increasingly found within advertising copy for pharmaceutical products in the trade and medical press. The materiality of a product could also be utilised to claim authenticity in a market made up of a chain of distribution. Technologies developed in the 18th century, with the likes of transfer printing and bottle moulding, had standardised packaging, meaning that the look of the product could be utilised to combat product substitution and imitation. Reductions in associated printing costs in the 19th century gave proprietors an efficient mechanism by which they could showcase visual representations of their products, down to the depictions of their seals, labels, and trademarks. Graphic communication of pharmaceutical products and their components increased in certain publications, such as the Chemist and Druggist and the Medical Press and Circular, during this period. The international distributors were increasingly common throughout the 19th century, with firms like Barclay and Sons leading the way. Advertising was one mechanism which aided the consumption of commercial medicines across the globe. This is reflected in the audience demographics of trade literature from the period. The Chemist and Druggist was established in Australia in 1885 and was regularly supplied to pharmaceutical societies based overseas. Likewise, the Trademarks Journal was registered for transmission abroad, and the Medical Press and Circular boasted that their annual double number would be sent to medical institutions in the United States, India, Australia, France, Germany, and Canada. However, with successful advertising via these kinds of mediums, popular products were at risk of imitation by overseas firms. Prior to the inception of trademark legislation, the law surrounding protection for marks was expensive and confusing, and concerns over counterfeiting marred developments for overseas expansion. Thomas Holloway, the largest advertiser in Britain, began to encroach on the American market from the early 1850s. But after numerous lawsuits involving substitution and imitation, he began to wind down operations. Trademark legislation passed in foreign countries began to help overseas commodity trading. In fact, it was implemented under similar systems and costs almost concurrently in numerous countries. Arrangements were also facilitated by the passing of domestic British trademark legislation. In 1883, legislation was passed that allowed for mutual protection to be agreed with foreign countries for inventions, designs, and registered trademarks. And significantly, from 1887, the USA and Britain formed a formal agreement. Thomas Beecham registered his first US trademark shortly after it was passed and began to target infringers in the courts, subsequently using the press to declare his victories. Likewise, the successful firm Burroughs Wellcome Co, established in 1880, utilised trademark legislation to carry out their business overseas. With the rising success of the firm came the increasing threat of imitation of their products. In New York, a product was put up for sale by a druggist named William Wilson under the name Room Tabloids, which was seen to imitate Wellcome's successful tabloid trademark, which had been registered in the USA in early 1885. Correspondence relating to this case gives insight into how Burroughs Wellcome Co managed product branding on an international scale, which included accessing legal advice from solicitors. Wellcome's confidence that the case would be won rested on similar court cases relating to trademark legislation, and his firm ultimately won an injunction against Wilson's product. Burroughs Wellcome Co registered trademarks in countries across the globe as a means to protect their trade. They used their successful trademark wins and advertisements in order to reiterate the rigorous nature of their prosecutions and the breadth of their power in the market. For example, the successful proceedings against a dispensary in Formosa was used in advertisements in the domestic market. And it is clear from their surviving business records that Burroughs Wellcome Co took protection of their brands very seriously in their overseas markets as well as their domestic. The overseas market for commercial remedies points to the increasing globalization of the marketplace, and phrases like sold by all grocers and chemists everywhere, common from the 1880s with an advertising copy, reflected these emerging markets. In turn, developments in packaging have been linked to increasing standardization of product manufacture and the displacement of local commodities. However, looking to advertisements in the trade press or surviving packaging does not reflect this generalization, and this next section evidences that manufacturers were mindful of distinct local markets. Pharmaceutical labels commonly featured the name and address of the retailer and played a key role in the materiality of the product. This can be seen as partly down to regulation. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 made it compulsory to include the seller's name and address on poisons. But it's also in part due to the address's role in giving supplementary information about its origins in a market that tended to play out on a local or regional scale. Local retailers could build up a reputation in a locality through face-to-face contact and word of mouth. A name could act as a form of branding. This is reflected in carrying on the name of the previous owner of a chemist shop after the retailer had sold up or passed away. Surveying the packaging found in retail chemist shop of the period further reveals the local nature of the market. In the early 20th century, Boots' strategy in the market was to take over pre-existing chemist shops. A list of in-house nostrums was given to the central office to assess whether they should continue to be sold. As such, at a branch in Aylesbury, which was previously an independent chemist shop run by a Mr. Palmer, Boots continued to sell the in-house nostrum, Palmer's Cough Elixir. Other ways to advertise came in the form of postcards, available cheaply from the 1890s. Firms selling pharmaceutical products utilised the postcard for promotional means. They were an effective way to list local stockists, and they could be used to insert into packaging. Local retailers could also stamp postcards produced from wholesalers and manufacturers with their own name and address. This gave independent retailers a means to show consumers what products they had available, as well as to promote their own retail space. In fact, manufacturers could benefit from this pre-established trust by allocating space on labels and packages for the local retailer's name and address. Advertisements in the chemist and druggist show that manufacturers offered product labels and wrappers with the chemist's name on for no extra charge. The prominence of own name drugs from the turn of the century seems to have been a reaction against increasing standardization. Allen and Hamburys offered individual packages and labels to pharmacists and noted that, quote, a distinct style of label can be reserved for every pharmacist in each locality, thus removing the only possible rejection which can be urged from factory-packed drugs and toiletry preparations. The American firm Evans, Lasher and Webb addressed country chemists in an advertisement in the Commerce and Druggist, informing them that they could securely deliver anywhere in the UK, and provided wrappers with the chemist's own name and address on, stating that, quote, "you can push your own." By the same token, Francis Newbery and Sons, agents for William Warner's Specialties, offered own name preparations for the trade, and the wholesalers and manufacturers, James Woolley, Sons and Co, offered their products under the NN range, which stood for no name, and it was noted that all goods in this series were labelled without the maker's name. The local shop was thus always represented heavily in its own retail space, regardless of where its stock may have come from. So this paper evidences that trademarks were used to establish and maintain reputation on a local, national and global level. British firms who sought to expand their trade abroad made use of trademark legislation to develop their brands and combat substitution. Fancy names increased in commercial value with the passing of the Trademarks Registration Act. And with developments in graphic communication, these qualities were increasingly depicted within advertisements and on labels and packaging. The use of the trademark as an asset to protect proprietors' rights in overseas markets was important for firms, particularly as prior to trademark legislation, the cost involved in tackling substitutions was expensive. This significance is indicated by the fact that legislation was developed almost concurrently around the world, and that by the early 20th century, there were reciprocal trade agreements in place. However, by assessing the advertisements aimed at retailers, the continued importance of the local market is also made evident. When chemists took over a previous chemist shop, many of them used the former owner's name within promotional copy, or carried on the sale of popular local products, indicating the significance of brands and their value, especially when tied to a particular area. Likewise, the presence of chemists' own name labels, sold via manufacturers and wholesalers, emphasises that names and addresses continue to be held in high regard as a means to communicate reputation and promote a business within a local or regional market. The preliminary observations made in this paper indicate the significant role that trademark legislation played on the market, whether that resulted in trends resulting from or in reaction to the increased use of fancy names for the selling of commercial remedies. Thank you.
Great, thank you ever so much, Laura. That was really stimulating and a really fascinating range of sources and images as well. Thank you. So if you've got any questions for Laura, if you want to put them in the chat, and we'll come to them after the next two talks when we've heard all three speakers. And Violetta has appeared on my screen, so hopefully she has on yours too. And we'll move on to Violetta's talk, which is about the ointment jar and the virtue of caritas in the apothecary's practice.
Yes, hello everyone. And Briony, thank you very much for the introduction. Just a small correction before I begin. I'm no longer at Memorial Sloan Kettering, and I identify as an independent researcher. My paper is concerned with the construction of professional identity by apothecaries in 15th, 16th century Europe, and with the use of visual symbols to communicate the virtues of the profession. The study focuses on the albarello, a ceramic pot that came to be regarded as one of the symbols of the apothecary trade. Let me pull up my presentation. Okay. Among a variety of containers that were used in European apothecary shops at the turn of the 15th and 16th centuries, the most ubiquitous were the albarelli, cylinder-shaped ceramic pots typically covered with a white glaze and decorative painting. In prosperous mercantile cities of Italy, France, northern Spain, and the Low Countries, there was hardly an apothecary shop that did not exhibit in its front room at least a few high-quality specimens. The image of an albarello in a mid-16th century Italian treatise on pottery making shows a tall cylindrical vessel with a wide mouth, slightly concave walls, and a low ring-shaped foot. The name albarello is Italian, but its exact derivation is uncertain. The earliest mention of albarelli in Italian textual sources occurs in Boccaccio Decameron, where the word is used to signify jars for storing ointments and electuaries. It is believed that the term may have Arabic roots, since the very first exemplars of glazed tall cylindrical pots came to medieval Europe from the Islamic East. The innovative glazing and firing techniques perfected by Islamic craftsmen, rendered earthenware more durable, impermeable to liquids, and aesthetically pleasing, which contributed to its popularity among dealers in spices, medicines, and aromatics throughout the medieval Mediterranean. After 1450, import of glazed ceramics from the Islamic lands to Europe was increasingly supplemented by local production. Apothecary establishments became major consumers of ceramic goods, and one of the most requested ceramic forms was the albarello. To be sure, albarelli were far from being the only type of container to be found in pharmacies, as John Henderson remarked, yet they quickly became one of the dominant forms of drug jar. So dominant, in fact, that the cylinder-shaped vessel came to be regarded as the quintessential pharmacy jar. Documentary and visual evidence corroborated by archaeological findings testify to the outsized popularity of albarello in 15th-16th century Europe. Yet scholars struggle to explain what it was exactly that made the jar special and ensured its remarkable success. The most common explanations, which tend to focus on functionality, ergonomics, and aesthetics, hold that albarelli were highly versatile storage containers, that their cinched waist made it easy to grasp them from the shelf, and that exotic oriental motifs occurring in their decoration helped create the mythical aura of the distant lands, the source of spices, aromatics, and miracle cures. However, one cannot but notice glaring blind spots in such interpretations, particularly as concerns the variety of ways in how the objects may have been understood and employed. In the cities, the popularity of albarelli extended well beyond the sphere of the apothecary's profession. The distinctively shaped vessels were used in the kitchen, gifted to the loved ones, and even represented in religious art, where they often appeared in the context of healing, purification, restoration, and comforting. Recent scholarship has challenged some common assumptions about the reception and treatment of objects in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Drawing on a wide range of sources, which included inventories of urban shops and private households, the authors of The Sacred Home in Renaissance Italy have demonstrated that a significant proportion of things that were kept in private homes and public places were treated as if they had spiritual significance. And that holds true, the authors argue, even for, quote, the Renaissance shop, a place more concerned with profit than religion, end quote. In her recent book covering the history, archaeology, and iconography of apothecary vessels from the late medieval and Renaissance periods, Danielle Alexander Vidon has looked more closely at the symbolic dimension of the albarello, pointing to the jar's chief purpose as container for ointments and to the traditional Christian interpretation of the ointment jar as a symbol of bodily and spiritual healing. She argues that albarelli acted as evocative, meaningful objects. They define the place as dedicated to the restoration of physical health, while also alluding to the healing power of faith. In this paper, I pursue this line of argument still further and aim to illustrate that much of the albarello's popularity in the West stemmed from the rich cultural connotations carried by the words ointment jar, which included not just the notion of healing, but also, and perhaps more importantly, of caritas. Caritas, or charity, emphasized both in religious moral discourse and in civic life, acquired particular importance for the medical profession, and also for apothecaries who strive to ennoble their occupation by giving it a clear medical orientation. At the time when apothecaries' concerns were focused on the professionalization and redefinition of their practice, a well-thought-out interior of the shop with a display of symbolic objects could play an important role in advertising the virtues of the profession. This paper explores some of the less common meanings of charity, which were pertinent to the apothecary's practice, and the perceptions of the albarello as the ointment jar. Okay, 1 second. It seems most appropriate to begin our exploration by looking at some definitions. There is no indication that prior to the 15th century, there existed in Europe a clear and agreed upon definition of the apothecary's craft, nor is there evidence of an emphasis placed on the pharmaceutical aspect of the apothecary's activities. In the 14th century, as Carles Vela has observed in his study of medieval Catalan sources, the situation was quite often the opposite. Quote, the more commercial activity of the apothecary had taken precedence over the medical activity, end quote. Apothecaries traded in a wide range of commodities, from medicines to dyestuffs, from candied fruit to scented oils, paternoster beads, incense, and candles. With tightening of municipal regulations on trade in medicinal stuffs, and with strict requirements of competence from apothecaries, there arose a need in instructional books that could provide essential definitions, concise explanations, and basic recipes. The first proper manual for apothecaries, Compendium Aromatariorum, which focused specifically on a pharmaceutical aspect of the craft and aimed to assist those preparing for qualifying examinations, was composed around the mid-15th century by Saladino Ferro de Ascoli, chief physician to Prince of Taranto. First published in 1488 in Bologna, the compendium became an instant bestseller, with no less than 5 incunable editions and at least 17 printings between 1488 and 1581, not only in Italy but also in France. In addition to Latin exemplars, there exists a 15th century Hebrew manuscript of Saladino's work, as well as early printed translations from Latin into vernacular languages. The first chapter of the manual is devoted, among other things, to what Saladino calls topics of benefit to apothecaries. It presents a clear definition of what constitutes the craft of the apothecary, provides a list of essential readings, and offers some thoughts on morals and behavior for a pharmacy practitioner. Significantly, Saladino indicates that for an apothecary to become successful and respected in his field, he needs more than intellectual capacity and technical competence. He has to be of good moral character and conduct himself in an appropriate way. Quote, he should be upright, just, and merciful, particularly to the poor. He should also be wise and experienced in his craft, not juvenile or inexperienced, because he has charge of men's lives, which is the most valued of all the possessions in the world. He should not be greedy, nor avaricious, nor an inordinate lover of money, nor should it appear that he does everything for money as the avaricious do, and still less should he sell things at higher prices than are just, because it is better to earn little justly than to earn much with curses, forcibly extracting it from the poor. End quote. The inclusion of a long passage dealing with morals in a book of practical nature was not in itself innovative. Combining the technical with the spiritual had become common in the genre of merchants' handbooks, popular compilations of practical advice, technical material, and ethical discussion that came into wide circulation in Mediterranean Europe since the 14th century. What seems by comparison somewhat unusual are the insistent repeated exhortations to exhibit merciful attitude, particularly towards the poor. These ideas became more elaborately expressed in a later treatise, Dispensatorium Pharmacopolarum, an apothecary's guide written in the first half of the 16th century by the German botanist, apothecary, and physician Valerius Burroughs. Burroughs' guide concludes with the section addressing the professional moral code of the apothecary. The author insists that it is only through the exercise of true pietas that one's actions can bear good fruit and bring safety and happiness. To earn praise and respect of all, an apothecary should, of his own will, embrace pietas, caritas, and humanitas. He should be kind, gentle, merciful, particularly towards the poor, courteous, and eager to come to aid. His actions should be guided less by the thought of profit than by kindness and compassion. The exercise of virtue, pietas, caritas, humanitas, in the sense of altruistic caring attitude towards one's neighbors, is thus regarded both as a moral obligation and as one of the keys to professional success. Burroughs' thoughts on ethics may have reflected not just his personal opinion, but general sentiment among pharmacy practitioners at the time. Recent scholarship has highlighted the important roles played by the related concepts of caritas, charity, and misericordia, mercy, in the construction of the apothecary's identity in the 16th century. Using the text of a late 16th century civic petition written by a Bolognese apothecary, Barbara di Gennaro Splendore has convincingly argued that in Bologna, as elsewhere, quote, mercy alongside craft was a pillar of apothecary's self-representation. By contrast, no matter how central financial transactions were to their activity, apothecaries worked hard not to be perceived as merchants, end quote. As historians of pharmacy describe, an apothecary shop in the times past could readily be identified by the shop sign and by the sweet intoxicating aromas of spices, drugs, and confections emanating from its front room. Once inside the shop, a customer would face the familiar attributes of the apothecary's craft, which doubled as professional symbols: a mortar, a balance, a furnace with alembics for distillation, and at least a few beautiful albarello jars. The same objects identified pharmacy in manuscript illuminations, woodcuts, and paintings, where they conveyed the concept of medicine store, and not necessarily in just a physical sense. In those visual constructs, in an ideal pharmacy where the boundaries between the material and the spiritual could not be easily drawn, the instruments of the craft could acquire additional meanings. Mortars could be construed as emblematic of patience and diligence, balances as symbolic of honesty, and alembics as indicative of technical prowess. But what about jars? According to 16th century medical writers, the surface finish of high-quality apothecary vessels, with its whiteness, smoothness, and brilliance provided by tin glazing, made the pots look like the alabaster jars, candore, nitore, livore, alabastritis proxima. Alabaster, a noble white stone that was understood to have come from Egypt and Syria, was well known in Europe since at least the 14th century. As pointed out by Alexandra Lipinska in her study of Netherlandish material, alabaster was one of the most popular stones used for religious and funerary sculpture in the period between the 14th and 17th centuries. The fashion for alabaster, Lipinska has argued, was a reflection of European fascination with the stone's unique physical properties, its beauty and fragility, and thus similarity to human body, and with its biblical associations with alabastrum, or in St. Jerome's translation, alabastrum unguenti, Mary Magdalene's ointment jar. Seen in this context, the repeated mentions of alabaster in pharmaceutical literature may suggest a symbolic association between fine apothecary vessels and biblical alabaster jar. In the case of albarello, such an association was bolstered by the similarity of function. The chief function of albarello in European apothecary establishments since at least the 14th century was to hold ointments. And it is precisely in that capacity that albarelli sometimes appeared in religious art, represented as attributes of Mary Magdalene and Cosmas and Damian. The veneration of saints was a prominent feature of 15th century culture, and Mary Magdalene and the unmercenary healers Cosmas and Damian were among the most popular saints. The devotion to the saintly figures found its visual expression in manuscript illuminations and in numerous paintings and sculptures that decorated public places and private homes. Given her image of the woman with the ointment jar, Mary Magdalene was strongly associated in the Christian imagination with charity care, hospitals, and apothecaries. The significations carried by the images of the Magdalene and those of her attribute, which was sometimes depicted as an albarello, become clearer when considered in the context of late medieval spirituality. The Magdalene was primarily understood as the embodiment of caritas, charity, and misericordia, mercy. In light of the characterization provided by Gregory the Great and later medieval interpretations, she came to be regarded as, quote, symbol of the conversion of the soul through love, caritas, end quote. The jar carried by Mary Magdalene, as Susan Hoskins explained, citing a 14th century Carthusian writer, symbolized the Magdalene's heart full of faith and charity. Catherine Ludwig Jansen, in her study of the late medieval attitudes to the saint, has similarly noted that the jar, when interpreted according to its allegorical sense, represented, quote, Mary Magdalene's opera misericordiae, or good works, symbols of her active life of charity, discharged for the sake of Christ's poor. The paragons of compassion and altruism in medicine were the saints Cosmas and Damian, the two brothers who, quote, cured the illnesses not only of men and women, but of animals, not taking any payment for their services, end quote. Either brother, though Damian more commonly than Cosmas, could be depicted carrying a vase filled with a miracle ointment. In some images, dating to the turn of the 15th and 16th centuries, the depicted vase resembles the apothecary's albarello. In the centuries that followed, Mary Magdalene and Cosmas and Damian, the embodiments of charity and altruistic service, would be claimed as patron saints of apothecaries. Apothecaries would self-identify less as merchants and more as professionals whose occupation implied moral responsibility and concern for the good of the community. In 15th century Europe, sermons, most notably by members of the two largest mendicant orders, the Franciscans and Dominicans, played a key role in conveying ethical concepts to the laity. In the words of Catherine Ludwig Johnson, quote, sermons were the mass media of the day. They had the ability both to shape popular opinion and to reflect it, end quote. The choice of topics for moralizing sermons by the friars were guided less by the liturgical calendar and biblical readings for the day and more by the social and moral issues troubling the lay community. Mendicant networks extended to nearly every corner of Europe. In the cities, the friars and merchants cultivated mutually beneficial relationships. The friars justified legitimate commercial activity and provided the growing mercantile class with spiritual and moral guidance, while the merchants took upon themselves financial support of the mendicant institutions. Not surprisingly, the self-perception of Renaissance merchants and their social identity were to a large extent shaped by the ethical principles promoted in mendicant sermons and Franciscan and Dominican theological discourse.
One more minute, please, Violetta.
Sure, yeah, I'm almost done. One of the most influential preachers of the day was Bernardino of Siena, member of the servant branch of the Franciscan order. In a series of sermons delivered to large crowds in Siena in 1427, Bernardino spoke at length about charity, addressing himself directly to local merchants, including apothecaries. According to Bernardino, charity can mean many things, from supporting local charitable institutions to speaking truthfully and kindly to one's neighbors and treating customers with honesty, fairness, and respect. In mendicants' view, charity could be as simple a gesture as offering a discount on merchandise to a person in need or free medicines to the poor. Charity was broadly defined as direct opposite of greed, envy, self-interest, and fraud. In late medieval sermons, exercising the virtue of charity often translated into living in harmony with one's neighbors and caring for the community, including its poorer members. Meaningful objects can play an important role in conveying ideas and attitudes. In 15th century Europe, the prevailing message heard in religious and civic spheres was that of charity, understood as a multifaceted concept encompassing the notions of faith, concern for the common good, and care for one's neighbors, including the sick and the poor. Caritas, Misericordia, Pietas, and Humanitas were regularly mentioned in professional literature in sections devoted to ethics. Apothecaries' preoccupation with creating a good public image of their profession was real and strong. Tellingly, the College of Apothecaries, established in Venice in 1565, nearly a century after the publication of Saladino de Ferra Compendium, required that those taking the qualifying examination read aloud some extracts from the opening chapter of Saladino's book that included the professional moral code for the apothecary. I attempted to illustrate that albarelli were well suited for the task of presenting the apothecary's profession in the best possible light. By virtue of their physical appearance and chief function, they could not but prompt in the viewer associations with the ointment jars of the saints, the metaphors for charity, and thus they reminded the beholder that caring for the sick demanded kindness, compassion, and altruism. Although albarello did not become the permanent symbol of pharmacy, it remained popular for centuries and earned official recognition as the pharmacy jar. One could argue that it was precisely the jar's symbolic meaning that was the determining factor in its enduring popularity in the West. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Violetta, and I can hear the echoes of the controversy between altruism and commercial success, coming down the centuries and still very much debated in pharmacy, I think, today by outsiders in particular. So thank you. Anybody with questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll move on to the third paper and ask Katarzyna to join us to give that, and then we'll come to questions for all three speakers.
Yes, I will start. Good afternoon. I will have two remarks. I do not work on pharmacy issues, but heritage studies, and I will be speaking mainly on museums of pharmacy, but tackling with heritage and issues. And another thing is that it's been heavy raining for the last 4 days in my. So if the Wi-Fi is very weak. We'll see if I can have a talk, I hope so. Now I will share, I hope to share, yes. I don't know if it's okay, if you can see the my presentation. Yeah?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, that's good. I will start with a quote. Now, I will be speaking about museums, the development of museums of pharmacy in post-Soviet countries. And I will start with a quotation that the president of the Lithuanian Society of Pharmacy said in 2017. The mission of a pharmaceutical museum is to protect the history and the heritage of establishing and operating the main pharmacies in a country. The history told by these museums casts light on the role of the pharmacy to the public. Contemporary pharmaceutical institutions became what they are, and on the future prospects of the pharmacies. And for my research, which is a larger research, I asked several questions which are here. Whether and to what extent pharmacy museums in the post-Soviet bloc contribute to a better understanding on the history of pharmacy, and I analyzed museums. Here for the presentation, I've chosen 5 case studies. What is the history of the museums? Who are the creators? What are the collections made up of? And does it refer to local tradition, traditional medicine, the history of pharmacy strictly related to a given country, or rather to a universal history? Post-Soviet countries, it's a very vast and large denomination which covers very large region, a blend of different cultures, starting of Avicenna and in Central Asia, in museums of pharmacy, always we can see in Tajikistan and in Uzbekistan, we always can see references to Avicenna, going through folk medicine, which is clearly visible in all the museums that I've analyzed. Early pharmacies, starting from the 18th century pharmacies and later 20th century pharmacies, and also Soviet pharmacy, which is quite an interesting case. As I mentioned, for my presentation, I've chosen only 5 museums. The first museum that I analyzed, this is the museum under the Black Eagle. I don't know how to make this presentation, but the title is also visible. This is the Under the Black Eagle Pharmacy Museum located in Lviv. The largest operating pharmacy on the territory of Ukraine, which was set up in 1735 by a German military pharmacist. Now it is, it was always located in the main square of the city, which is a part of the heritage, of UNESCO heritage. The pharmacy still exists, however, in 1986 it was transformed into the museum. It is composed of 16 rooms which can be visited. Each room presents a history of pharmacy from a different epoch. It contains a galenic laboratory, alchemy workshop, pharmaceutical appliances, prescriptions, tablet drugs, pharmacy tools, library with old pharmacopoeias, old pharmacy-related books, prescription books, and calendars, and many other materials. I don't have time to analyze all these materials. I can see that time is my enemy. In the trading hall, there is on the prescription desk, there are 3 chemists' scales installed, and there is a big exposition of samples of the first manual apparatus for making drugs and pills, various presses for producing juice from medical raw materials, drying cupboards, a rare collection of measuring devices. The museum has a very rich, both in terms of quality and quantity, library. As for 2018, it had more than over 1,000 ancient medical books, 2,000 copies of medical pharmacy literature, and other unique copies. And it has to be mentioned that they are not digitized and very difficult to find on the internet or in other libraries. The next museum that I will this is the museum in Kiev. Very quickly, the museum was established in 1986, and the idea of creating the museum was earlier. And the collection is composed of 50,000 exhibits, pharmacy furniture from 18th and 19th century, samples of pharmaceutical tableware from different epochs, and also in the library. There is also an exhibition about the history of medicine and pharmacy, and it focuses mainly on ethnopharmacology. And there is also a reconstructed house of the local folk healer Znachorka. I would like to mention that, as I could see, every museum in question focuses on folk medicine. The next museum is the Museum of Lithuanian History of Medicine and Pharmacy, which is in Kaunas. It's not the capital of Lithuania. That's another city located in Kaunas, and it's a subdivision of the Lithuanian University of Health Science. It's located in the town square, and its history dates back to 1930. The Lithuanian Pharmacist Society and Pharmaceutics Union set up a pharmacy museum. In 1940, the occupation of Lithuania by the Soviet Union stopped the plans to develop the museum, and unfortunately, most of the exhibits were lost. However, in 1957, the Professor Alfonsas Krirakis from the Kaunas University, he decided to open a museum. And to found a museum, he started collecting exhibits, and he gave to the museum mainly his private collection. The museum moved in the late 80s here to this building, and it was the first museum of this kind in the territory of Lithuania. Its permanent collection consists of the equipment, instruments belonging to pharmacies, doctors, hospitals, pharmaceutical companies. There is also a reconstructed typical Lithuanian pharmacy from the end of the 19th century, along with its furniture, tools from collections from many Lithuanian pharmacies. Everything it has been reconstructed, and there are also scenes from the prehistory of medicine and pharmacy, also reconstructed house of folk healer Znachorka. The next one is in Riga, is a part of the Museum of Medicine, established also in the late 30s, like the previous one, and it is composed of collections of Latvian pharmacists. Also, there are collections given by famous doctors, and Miecznikov, who is the only one Latvian who got the Nobel Prize for his studies in immunology. He offered his collection in 1975. Also, there is a house of Znachorka apart from the traditional 19th century museum. And now another museum, it is in Tajikistan, Isfara Museum of Traditional Medicine, which is built on the territory, on the premises of the Isfara Sanatorium Samrat. It's the complex, which is the largest climatic and balneological multi-profile health complex of the Republic of Tajikistan. Opening of this museum was celebrated, and also the president came to open with a huge pomp the museum, which concentrates mainly on herbal medicine. Now, as I presented very briefly these museums, I would like to say what can we, whether and in what way we can use museum collections, what we can use. Firstly, it is the libraries. All the museums except Tajikistan Museum, they have very rich libraries. The visual materials, the visual archives and photographs which are related to the history of pharmacy. The museum premises, they are built very often on reconstructed pharmacy chambers from the turn of the 19th and 20th century, or there are thematic halls. Also, there are exhibits, antique furniture, vessels, scales, pharmaceutical tools, and medicines. Among the written materials, these I would like to mention. These are prescription books, all prescription books which are in all the museums. All prescription books are of particular importance for research into the history of pharmacy. They are one of the most reliable sources of information about medical therapeutics. Prescription books were compulsory official documents where the pharmacists were obliged to set down all the details regarding how to make, who was the patient, who got this, what was the price of the medical, and also in of museums. There are pharmacopoeias from the oldest pharmacopoeia, which is an approved collection, is an official collection of approved pharmaceutical standards. In the museum in Lviv, there is a national pharmacopoeia from 1777. Also in Riga, there is a pharmacopoeia which can be consulted. At the Museum of Kiev, there is a prescription book which is open for visitors, so everybody can go through this prescription book and see what kind of prescription, what was given. I would like also to mention one element. This is the pharmacy delita in Kaunas, Lithuania. And I would like to mention about the importance of photographs in the museums and the museum's archives as a way of example. And this is a period of the history of pharmacies in Lithuania, which is already forgotten. In 1970s, Society of Architects of Lithuania, they decided that Lithuanian pharmacies would be very rich in for visitors, and it's the only phenomenon that existed in all the post-Soviet countries. In one of the pharmacies, there was a fountain. There were stairs made of marble and frescoes of. There were frescoes and beautifully decorated ceilings. However, after Lithuania regained independence in 1992, all this was destroyed, and this is the only pharmacy which was not destroyed. The others we can see only on photographs in the archives of the Lithuanian Pharmacy Museum. The museums, I think I don't have time more, so I will just quickly show this slide. The museums which I've analyzed, they consist of either former pharmacy chambers or the rooms that were created for educational purpose. And we have officina, coctoria, material room, residential room, laboratories. Sometimes they still work, sometimes they are just to visit for guests. And the following rooms are created for educational purposes in the research museums. This is Znachorka room and alchemist room. This is the example of Ficina at the Lviv Museum. And as time is going on, I will just finish in 1 minute. Also, I will mention, I just couldn't help, I had to show the slide. I discovered Capum Mortum as a way of example of the tools that we can, and not only the tools, but also medicine that were used. It's the exhibit from the Museum of Lithuanian Medicine in Kaunas, Caput Mortum. It's a male booster which was made of dead people. But yes, according to what I've analyzed, museums in question, they are the main source of research in the history of pharmacy. Very little has been written on the history of pharmacy in the countries in question. There has been a couple of books on medicine in the Soviet Union. However, the history of pharmacy is the topic clearly under research. And the materials, if something is written, it is written mainly in local, if we can say so, national languages. Mainly in Tajikistan, it's mainly in Russian and Tajik, in Uzbek, in Ukrainian. A couple of articles has been written in English regarding the museum in Riga. Therefore, the museums of pharmacy in these countries, as I've given on, as I presented very shortly, out of more than 60 museums, only 5, they are very valuable source of the history for the researchers of the history of pharmacy. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Katarzyna. At a time where we can't travel, it's quite something to be taken to all of those different museums in 15 minutes, and thank you. I've heard through the grapevine that we're allowed to run over slightly our hour, if that's okay with the participants, so that there's some time for some questions. We've got quite a few in the chat. If the 3 speakers want to unmute themselves and put their videos on, if their internet will allow that, that would be great. And I'll go back to the top of the chat stream and identify some questions, if that's okay. So if we start near the top and back to Laura, you will have seen, I expect yourself, Greg Higby's asked, are chemists' own name products still produced in the UK? And if not, when did they disappear? Is that something that you'd like to comment on?
Yes, I'm not entirely sure on this. However, I found an article in the House Staff magazine in the Beecham's archives, and they talk about own names trend being sort of really apparent in the 20s and 30s. And this article in this magazine was written in the 50s, sort of looking back. So it looks like even sort of after the period that I'm interested in, I think the sort of trend takes off even more in the 20s and 30s. And then certainly by the 50s, it seems to have sort of closed off. And then my guess would be sort of like with different regulation coming in around sort of like labels and having to have sort of certain names on and ingredients on labels. I'd assume sort of that's when it sort of tails off. But I'm not entirely sure sort of the exact dates, but it does look to be the 20s and 30s.
It not be a possibility once you start to require more information and more standardization of patient information, as well as formulations, that sort of thing, I think probably will come into play as well. There's more to go there. Okay, let's move to a question for Violetta, or at least there were comments for Violetta. Again, Greg Higby was asking whether he's normally portrayed holding an albarello, and you certainly showed an image of him holding one. Is that the case for all images of St. Damien?
Oh, this is an excellent question. No, it's not the case for all images. He was often depicted holding a medicine jar full of pills, or a spatula, or a palm branch, indicating that he was a martyr. So the albarello jar was just one of the ways to identify him as a healer, but it becomes more and more common sometime maybe after the 15th century, as far as I know, if that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. No, as a symbol, it's really a strong one, but not the only one. Okay. Katarzyna, you've been asked whether any of the prescription books that you mentioned that are in the museum collections, whether they've ever been transcribed.
I don't know if I understand the word transcribe.
Oh, that's okay. So, if I don't know what language the prescriptions are written in, are they written
No, they
in?
were not. They are written in the prescription books. They are okay. The prescription books, they are written in Russian. They are written in Ukrainian, and they are written in Polish because also in Polish. They were not. No.
No, so that they're in their original language.
Yes. This is the problem, that for those who do not speak Ukrainian, Tajik, Uzbek, or Russian, it may be a bit difficult to study.
And to compare them, I guess. And another question for you, Katarzyna. Greg Bond has asked, do the museums and their exhibits that are now obviously in independent countries, do they address the history of pharmacy from the Soviet era? And if so, how do they interpret that Soviet?
Yes, there are exhibits from the Soviet era. Very interesting, I find. There is something which is called iron wine, and it is sold in Lviv at the museum under the Black Eagle. Iron wine has nothing to do with alcohol. It's a drink made of iron, which is supposed to help in the case of if we have anemia. And it's been sold, I don't remember since when, but it was very popular, very common after the Chernobyl catastrophe. And we can still buy it. Another medicine, I don't know if we can call it interesting, at the Museum of Riga, we can have, we can visit food and pharmaceutical used by Soviet astronauts. I didn't put it on slide. Yes, they just, it's a part, the question in what way they are presented as a continuous part of the tradition, of pharmacy tradition.
Thank you. No, interesting. I'll come back to you, Laura. There's a few other questions you'll see in the chat. Greg Bond asked whether, in comparison maybe to the US market, are there racist or stereotypical ethnic or racial names or images in graphic advertising or promotional materials in the products rather, that you've been looking at in the UK?
So I can't think of sort of any overtly sort of racist brand names off the top of my head, but I think there are certainly sort of stereotypical imperialistic images used in promotional copy at the time. Sort of Burroughs Wellcome Co in particular used the explorer Henry Stanley as part of their sort of product advertising, and sort of used imperialistic motifs throughout their promotions. And then sort of lots of these firms also advertised in sort of like missionary magazines and the British and colonial druggists in those types of press. So I think it would be interesting to see maybe how different products were advertised differently in sort of the colonial press as well.
And that follows on to Stuart Anderson's question, which is, were the images used for overseas markets, such as India, he asks, tailored to the local market? Can you see changes across different countries for international products?
So yeah, you can't, specifically with Burroughs Wellcome Co, they had their own advertising departments. They were quite sophisticated, and you can sort of see evidence of segmented marketing through them. They'd sort of change their brands to sort of reflect sort of names in the local market. But they also use the English name as well alongside it. And there's lots of discussion sort of in their archives about sort of how they should change it to fit those markets. And I think with other types of firms as well, I think the product, I think it's Dr. Williams Pink Pills for Pale People, that's actually called something different in the Chinese market. They use a Chinese name and change the colour to red, because that has sort of more cultural significance for that market. So even in the sort of early period, you see sort of segmented marketing. But in terms of specifically sort of India and stuff, I think I don't know how much they changed it for sort of more colonial markets, whether they were selling it to a sort of, sort of like people, like English people living over there, or whether they were trying to sell to the actual like indigenous population. Be interesting to see how maybe they changed that.
Definitely, that would be a really interesting thing to investigate, whether there was an expat market that required something different. I expect it might. Thank you. Another question for Katarzyna. Someone who's Nancy Campbell has asked you, were the legal frameworks that govern prescriptions similar across the post-Soviet countries, or did they differ from each other? So were they similar or different?
In the Soviet Union?
In the post-Soviet countries. So one after the Soviet Union, is there the same?
Each of the countries has their own legal system. They are just independent countries. So the legal system absolutely not the same.
Okay, that's a straightforward answer. Thank you. I'm just scrolling back up to check whether there's lots of comments that I hope the speakers are seeing, with all sorts of ideas for further research, and Julia from the Wellcome sharing images. I hope you've seen, Violetta, of a 20th century advert that was used to advertise Distoquane, an antibiotic that includes an albarello. So interesting to see the longevity of the albarelli as pharmaceutical symbols.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anybody else got any other questions? We have run slightly over, so if people want to finish there, that's fine. No, all gone quiet. Well, thank you ever so much to the three speakers. Really interesting talks, and lovely as a museum curator to see all of that great source material from collections being used and enjoyed. So thank you all very much, and thank you everyone for attending and all of the questions in the chat. It's been a really good session. Thank you very much. You'll see that Greg Bond has just reminded us in the chat that the next session, which I think starts at 6:30 my time, is a book talk. Looks like a fascinating book, Compound Remedies, Galenic Pharmacy from Ancient Mediterranean to New Spain, by Paula de Vos. So I hope you can join for that one as well. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.